I think we're good, Bridget.
Okay, I did not hear the introduction. Did they play that? I wasn't able to hear it. Okay, sorry about that. Not sure why I wasn't able to hear it. So hello and welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this virtual event today that we're hosting in conjunction with the release of a new report written by Elliot Haskell and published by the Better Life Lab and New America, where we're exploring the private sector in solving the nation's childcare crisis. I'm Bridget Schulte, a journalist, author, and director of the Better Life Lab at New America, where we use the power of narrative and solutions-focused research and journalism to elevate the value of care, advance work-family justice, and promote intersectional gender equity. So we're delighted to be partnering with Elliot on this. Elliot is a Capita Senior Fellow, a Better Life Lab reporting grantee, and a prolific author and deep thinker on early care and education. So when it comes to our nation's care crisis, we've made great progress in these past several years building awareness and understanding of how broken the system is. And that's thanks to a lot of tireless advocacy and narrative work of Elliot, the lab, and many others, advocates, activists, all sorts of leaders at the national, state, and local level. The COVID-19 pandemic that shuttered childcare facilities and schools and disrupted work, care, and family life for millions brought even more attention to how critical childcare is for families and for the nation. That high quality childcare is key to healthy child development and stable families and communities. It keeps parents employed and businesses running and the economy humming. It is a public good, just like K-12 education or public parks or libraries. The pandemic also showed us a much wider audience that the system is set up to fail. Childcare, just like K-12 education and public parks and libraries, is a market that doesn't work. Parents pay too much, early care and education teachers earn too little, and most small mom and pop providers barely scrape by. So now the question is, what do we do? How do we build an equitable, high quality, universal childcare system available to all families who need it? And that support and that quality, that supports also a high quality workforce with good jobs that are big enough to sustain human life. As many of you know, we at the Better Life Lab have been tracking innovations and solutions in the childcare sector with research, journalism, and reporting grants for the last several years. Sustained public investment is critical. But how do we look for solutions now while keeping our eye on that North Star vision? And what role can and should the private sector play in this particularly unique American context? So for that, that's going to be the discussion that we're going to be engaging in today. Let me turn things over to Elliot. He'll share some top findings from the report that we're releasing today, and then lead a panel discussion with leaders from the childcare and business communities. And then the Better Life Lab staff writer, Rebecca Gale, she'll help facilitate questions to Elliot and the panel. So please be sure to have your questions ready. There's a Q&A function. You could be sending your questions all throughout the conversation, and we'll be getting to them toward the end. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Elliot.
Thank you, Bridget, very, very much. I really appreciate your support and the support of the Better Life Lab and New America in making this report happen. And I appreciate everyone being here. And I also want to really thank the panelists for being here. This isn't an easy conversation, but it's an important conversation. And we have respondents who come from a diversity of perspectives. And that's what we want. I want to have a full conversation and wrestle with these questions that the report raises. So, a real thanks to the panelists for being here. So I'm going to go through for about 15 minutes, the sort of summary of the report. And really, they wrote this report to try to answer a couple of big questions. One, what is the proper role of employers with regards to childcare? Two, what are really the philosophical and practical costs, both literal costs and opportunity costs, that arise from promoting and incentivizing employer-sponsored childcare? And thirdly, what are alternative models that still engage employers? Because there's a couple of sort of grounding principles. Clearly, employers have a role to play when it comes to childcare. They are a stakeholder. And right now, in a lot of cases, employers are not engaged one way or the other, while they are benefiting from the public and a lot of parent fees going into the childcare system. So those are the questions that were overarching when I was thinking about producing, analyzing, and writing this report. And I also want to give a couple of caveats as we work on this. So, first of all, I think the intentions of just about everyone in this conversation are good. The intentions of the business leaders who are offering childcare benefits for their employees are generally good. I think the intentions of the policymakers who are pursuing incentives in the form of tax credits, grants, and other incentives for businesses to do this are generally good. I think the intentions of the organizations in the childcare sector who are working with businesses are good. So that's a first principle. The intentions here are good. And again, employers should be involved. That's no, this point of this is not to say employers should be completely divorced from the childcare conversation. And the third thing is I want anyone to mishear me as saying, and I don't think there should ever be such a thing as like an on-site childcare program. On-site childcare programs can be really effective and strong options, especially in industries like healthcare, where lots of employees are working strange hours. And if you look around the world, even at some of the best regarded childcare systems, many of those, there are on-site programs as part of those systems. They're just folded into a broader publicly funded system. So just a few caveats there as we get started. I think it's important just to ground ourselves in some history around the rise of employer-sponsored childcare benefits. So after Richard Nixon vetoed the Comprehensive Child Development Act in 1971, the 70s saw an enormous number of working mothers entering the workforce. You had by the end of the decade, close to half of all mothers of young children are in the workforce. And at the same time, their childcare needs are starting to explode. There's no system there to meet them. And you start seeing government and advocates who had previously been really pushing for these universal solutions start to turn their eyes towards employers. So Jimmy Carter's administration has a White House conference on children and families where they're talking about employers having a role. Ronald Reagan's Administration for Children and Families actually funds a 350-page book on employer-sponsored childcare benefits. They call it an idea whose time has come. And throughout this, you start to see a turn again from the advocacy community. Even groups like the National Organization for Women start to sort of turn and say the political landscape has changed. Universal solutions are no longer on the table. So we're going to start really advocating for employers to get involved. The tax incentives for employer-sponsored childcare show up in the early 80s in tax law. And then even as late as the late 90s, in 1997 and 1998, the Clinton administration gets involved in this. In 1998, President Clinton hosts a Rose Garden event surrounded by Secretaries of Treasury, the Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the CEOs of Eli Lilly, the CEOs of the Travelers Group Insurance Company, right, and the head of the AFL-CIO, and releasing a Treasury Department working group paper about employer-sponsored childcare benefits. So I bring this all up to say we've been trying this for a while, and one of my sort of organizing principles here is it really hasn't seemed to work. It has not been a scalable solution. And actually, the reason they don't have Presidents Bush or Obama up here is because the early parts of the 21st century actually saw a lot of states and the federal government pull back because they had all these tax credits and no one was actually using them. So almost a dozen plus states repeal employer-sponsored childcare tax credits between 2002 and 2017. So it's in vogue again, but I do think there's some reason for caution when we think about sort of the history in the past 50 years of trying to get a childcare system that works for parents and for children and for educators, that leaning on employers has not worked. And so it makes me skeptical that leaning on employers hard now would necessarily have a different outcome. But there are also some deeper philosophical considerations under this. And one is this question of like, what is childcare for and who is it for? Is childcare just a work support? Or are there broader implications of having a childcare system to family flourishing, family freedom, self-determination, the ability to choose where you want to live, to be able to invest in your community, how many kids you want to have, right? Like in a country where having large families is starting to become a luxury good, this idea of cementing childcare as primarily to entirely a work support that is to be acquired through the employer-employee relationship really brings up some real questions about what we're saying about childcare and what that means for our future efforts to build an effective system. I think that also can lead you to, when you prioritize employers in this, it can lead you towards what I've called the minimum viable childcare fallacy, which basically means if all you're trying to do with childcare is help parents go to work so that you're keeping the business bottom line in the kind of vague economy like running, then you actually don't want to invest in a super effective system that has really high paid educators and that has lots of different options. All you need is a minimum system that's gonna work okay. And at some point, actually, when you start putting in tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars of public money to get a system that works for everyone and that has well-compensated, stable educators, you're eating into the return on investment, if that's like the lens through which you're looking at it. So I think, again, there's some dangerous, or at least some things to be wary about philosophically when we think about leaning on employers. There's also a question of, you heard Bridget say at the beginning, we've been saying, many of us advocates for a while, childcare is a public good. It's a public good. It's a public good. We don't provide public goods through employers. We don't expect employers to provide the second grade. In fact, it comes across as pretty farcical to say, like, you should have an on-site elementary school. So to say that employers should be providing childcare then really positions childcare much more in the basket of private services that we get through either ourselves or with a little help from our employers, things like gym memberships, pet care, things like that. Like, there's a basket of things that are society sort of, no one really thinks that you have a claim on society's help with, or a claim on public dollars around. And so when we think about public goods versus private goods, I think we do need to think about what are we saying when we're asking government to put taxpayer dollars behind incentivizing these benefits. So those are philosophical considerations that I think we need to wrestle with. But I want to be fair, and I think some of the panelists will talk about this later on, but there are reasons to think there's reasons why this is popular. It does help the business bottom line, right? There's no question that there's evidence that employers that offer childcare benefits have better retention, particularly for parent employees. Right? That's absolutely true. There is an argument to be made that this is good for women in particular because the childcare burden obviously falls disproportionately on women. And so if there is more employer-linked childcare, that potentially increases their ability to engage in the labor force, increase their earning potential and their economic security, and also, again, get them into industries they might not otherwise be able to access. And there's an argument it can be an on-ramp to broader advocacy, that if you have a business that hasn't thought about childcare at all and you start engaging them around offering childcare for their employees, you may be able to walk them towards the idea of actually we need a public system. In fact, so I do want to be fair that there are, I think, perfectly reasonable arguments, and I want to say this again, like, this is one of those issues reasonable people can reasonably disagree. I think that's really important to continually emphasize. Um, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the practical considerations, because this is, I think, where in a lot of ways the rubber hits the road. There are some real reasons to be concerned about employer-sponsored childcare benefits. One is unfairness. So that's both within companies and between companies. Between companies, look, there are only large, for the most part, large companies are able to offer these benefits. If you are a gig worker in this country, and there are millions of them who are parents, if you are, you are no access to employer-sponsored childcare benefits because you don't have an employer of record. Right? If you are working in one of the many, many small businesses in this country, to have 5 to 10 employees, the odds that your employer is going to be able to offer a childcare benefit is pretty low. And within companies, these benefits tend to flow with pretty disproportionately to higher earning kind of white collar workers. usually those who are working at a headquarters office. This is not entirely. You can find examples of companies that are offering benefits to all employees, to frontline employees who have a center at a distribution plant or at a factory. So I don't want to say it is exclusively going to higher income white collar workers, but disproportionately it is. And there's also a question of even within those, which workers are able to actually access those benefits? Because even in the case of subsidized childcare at an on-site center, it's still frequently not free. So there are real fairness and equity considerations. There's a consideration around job lock. So we most often hear about job lock when it comes to health insurance, but the same idea applies to childcare. That if you're going to sort of lose your job, lose your childcare is a pretty awful equation. I would actually argue in some ways more awful than losing your health insurance because there is no COBRA. There is no Affordable Care Act marketplace. There is just the wasteland that is our childcare system. And there's a third person in this equation who's the kid. And as we know, young children thrive on consistency with the relationship with caregivers. And so having them be pulled away from a beloved caregiver because their parent was laid off, is a real challenge, and it also limits workers' mobility. Like job lock, we should say it's good from an employee perspective because it keeps your employees. It's not great from an employee perspective because it means that if you want to take another job, if you want to leave your job because you're dissatisfied with it, your ability to do that is pretty severely limited if your child care is linked in tied to your job. Fickleness, if you saw my Fast Company article this morning, I homed in on this issue. Employers can and do change their minds. We've seen just in the past couple of months, right? Google shutting down their on-site center, General Mills shutting down their on-site center, several hospital systems shutting down their on-site centers. And so we see this, and the equation is different. In those cases, they're doing it as a cost-cutting measure. They're not doing it unlike the many kind of community programs and independent programs that are struggling right now. They're really not closing them because they don't have any other choice. They're closing them because they don't want to keep operating anymore. They don't prefer to have that on their books. So that's another sort of challenge. There are some real systems building concerns here. What I mean by that is, for the most part, and I will talk about one exception to this a little bit later. But for the most part, employer-sponsored childcare benefits do not put new money into our starved childcare system. They are replaced if you're offering a stipend, or if you're offering waitlist priority, right? Like you might be basically replacing a piece of the already inadequate parent fees with company money, and that's good for the employee. It doesn't do anything for the system of choice, right? For a vibrant system with lots of different choices. It doesn't really add new supply. You could argue that if there's an on-site center where there wasn't before, there's now a new program in that community. But the fact is, given that we're still 30,000 childcare educators down nationwide from pre-pandemic levels, I can argue in the report, you're squeezing on the same sides of a too small balloon. You're not actually building out the system. And that's another challenge, I think. I think about the last thing is you're not building a system with lots of choices, right? For the vast majority of these benefits go towards center-based care, which is one option. Family child care is generally not engaged. It certainly doesn't engage family, friend, and neighbor care. Doesn't generally engage faith-based care. It doesn't engage, stay-at-home parents. So it's also a pretty narrow aperture into what part of the system are we sending resources towards. And then there are opportunity costs. So there are a couple of different opportunity costs. One is very practical. So if a state is taking money and putting it towards incentives for employer-sponsored childcare, they are not using that money for something else. And that they give the two examples that I want to highlight in the report. One is of Iowa. So Iowa's been setting aside about $25 million a year in state money for their employer-sponsored childcare incentives. That's about a third of their child care development block grant money they get every year. So the simple counterfactual where they just took that state money and put it into their existing child care system for everyone would increase their child care funding that's more targeted by a third. And then at the same time, Iowa chose in 2022 not to spend $3 million of state money to draw down $30 million of additional federal money. So, there's some odd incentives where a state kind of say, oh, we're doing something about childcare, but at what cost? And it's not just red states. So New York also put in a 50 million or proposing $50 million for their employer incentives right alongside the governor vetoing a bill that would have essentially decoupled to these very strict, like you only get subsidy for the very specific work hours that you work. And advocates are very clear that that's punitive to lower income families, single parents, parents who are work non-traditional hours. And advocates peg the cost of that at about $40 million. And the governor of New York said that's too expensive at the same time that they were spending $50 million in employer incentives. So that's not hypothetical. There is an actual opportunity cost in a practical way. And then there's also a real a political opportunity cost in a couple of ways. One is just an attention. Like I kind of joke in the report, but we're having this conversation. We're spending our time talking about this, reading about this. Is time we're not spending talking about fighting for a publicly funded system that works for everyone. Every meeting that an advocate has where they're talking about employer-sponsored childcare is a meeting we're not talking about a universal system. So there's a political opportunity cost there. And then there's also an opportunity cost of who are we giving the more political power to? And this is a very uncomfortable conversation. And I know we don't love to have it as a sector, but I want to humbly suggest we need to start talking about it more. Uh, there is pretty strong evidence that business interests are not always the friend to the childcare sector when it comes to fighting for the amount of public funding that is required to have a system of choice that works well, that is affordable, that has well-paid and well-compensated educators. We've seen business like the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers fight Build Back Better with 6 to 7 figure ad buys. In states, we have seen business regularly fight against tax increases, that would, again, in many cases have funded public services, including childcare. So but the more that we are giving businesses a sort of place of privilege, and prominence in the childcare conversation, the more that their voices are going to be the loudest ones, the more that they're going to be the ones defining what childcare is and what childcare needs. And then the ones in generally running the most childcare centers tend to be large for-profit corporate chains that have investors, either in the case of Bright Horizons, that is publicly traded on the stock market, in the case of Childcare, that is owned by a private equity firm. And again, we've seen in the Build Back Better fight that the private equity-backed childcare was working in many cases behind the scenes at raising objections. We have seen in other industries that private equity firms have generally I will say they have a track record of working against the public interest, whether that's spending tens of millions of dollars lobbying against bills to curb surprise medical billing. So we really need to talk about that. Do we want to be using taxpayer money? And do we want to be advocating for government to be incentivizing businesses to have more influence in childcare and for private equity firms to have more influence in childcare? So and that kind of gets to this question of like the thing I think I most often hear as a rejoinder to all of this is, well, why not? Why is such a big problem that we have employer-sponsored childcare here as community childcare is there? Like, why not both? And my answer is there are some things in childcare that are additive. Like we should have some policies that are supporting family, friends, and neighbor caregivers. We should have policies that are supporting licensed formal care. Like that is additive. They help each other, right? Like we have a better system overall if we're working on multiple things at once. Here, they're substantially different paths. The path where you cement childcare as an employer-sponsored benefit and a service to be acquired privately through the employer-employee relationship, and a path where you go towards a more universal system that is largely publicly funded and that is open to everyone, like those are not they diverge at a certain point, and I would argue we've probably reached the point where those two things diverge. So I don't think this is the case where we can just say we're going to let 1,000 flowers bloom. I actually think this is a place where we have to start making some difficult decisions from a policy standpoint, from a political standpoint, from a communication standpoint, from an advocacy standpoint, to say what's the path we're going down and why, and what do we think is going to be the consequence of doing this. So I'm going to start wrapping up here by saying, all right, what are the alternatives? Like what's all of the skepticism that I have, what would I like to see businesses do? One is advocacy for a publicly funded system. So for all those things I just said about the danger of having business having too much power in the politics of childcare, the fact is they are an influential voice. Business in general is very influential. And if they can come together and advocate for a publicly funded system and say, look, like we're going to need to find some new tax revenues. We're going to need to find the money to make this work because it will be good for my employees. It'll be good for my community. It will be good for the country writ large. And that's good for me. Like that can actually be very powerful. And we've seen this in places like Vermont, where the business community up there, essentially, as one article put it, they said, tax me. They were open. They were the ones fighting for a small payroll tax that is funding some pretty amazing improvements and reforms up in Vermont. And they would go before the state legislature and testify. So I think that idea of, if a business wants to get involved in childcare, like absolutely flex that political muscle, but don't flex it for individualized benefits that only help you and your employees, flex it for the sake of a publicly funded system that is going to help your employees and everyone else as well. The second thing would be supporting community-based programs. So we've seen this in places like the Corning Inc. has done this for many, many years, where they put money into local childcare programs, that are not exclusively available for their employees, but that are available for everyone. Excuse me. And by doing that, again, they strengthen the community childcare infrastructure. I think for companies that don't just exist in one community, but are all across the country and are relying on things like stipends more than on-site centers, and they need to be thinking about, can they match that stipend? So part of this goes to help a parent's affordability, but part of this also is going to go directly to the center that the parent is enrolled in, just as a no strings attached capacity building grant. Things like that, I think are sort of the one exception, because that does put new money into the system. That does avoid things like job lock. It avoids many of the concerns that I raised earlier. It's not perfect, but as an incremental step, while we're all working towards building a system that works for everyone, I think that's a pretty reasonable offering. And the third thing is to start preparing to be integrated into a future system. So, like I mentioned, countries like France, which I talk about in the report, have plenty of on-site childcare, but it's wrapped into their publicly funded system. So it's the same regulation, as the same fee structure as a municipal center or another kind of nonprofit center. And for programs that currently exist, I think there's that question of, okay, so as more money starts getting unlocked, as we start moving towards a system that works, what is our role in it? What do we want to do with the offerings that already exist that's going to so that we can be integrated rather than working at cross purposes? I will say, so to close, I think this conversation is an inflection point. At the moment, childcare benefits that are run through employers are not incredibly widespread. It's about 11 to 12% of all workers, about a third of higher income workers have access to them. So we have a moment right now to really think about the path that we want to take. And again, I don't necessarily blame the employers here. I think employers are simply inherently mismatched with a childcare system that sees childcare as an essential service that supports human flourishing, that supports families in all of the different settings and all of their needs and all of their preferences. So again, I was just sort of put a fine point on that. Like, we have to ask ourselves, what is the proper role of employers? And what are the risks of continuing to say through government incentives that we think childcare should be run through the employer-employee relationship, as opposed to saying the proper role of employers is to link arms and use every bit of their force and muscle and assets and power and money to move us towards a system that works for business, but more importantly, works for parents, works for kids, works for educators, and works for the country writ large. So again, I really appreciate all of your time. I am excited to hear the panelist responses, so I'm gonna zip it here and hand it over to Rebecca Gale and let her moderate the next part of the webinar.
Elliot, thank you so much for that. I've had a chance to read the report and I can echo how effective it is and really laying out these cases and the questions that you mentioned. And as part of our larger discussion, we've brought in a number of early childhood stakeholders to hear their reactions and responses, as well as their real world experience working with people and providers and children, and what they think future paths might look in this conversation. So I'll give an introduction. I'll give a brief introduction to each of them, and then we can turn it over to hear what they have to say. First, we have Erica Phillips, who is the Executive Director of the National Association for Family Childcare. Then we have Nicole Reel, who is President and CEO of the Executives Partnering to Invest in Children. Then we have Carmi Medoff, the founder and CEO of Onsite Kids. And finally, we have Miriam Calderon, who is the Chief Policy Officer of 0 to 3. So thank you guys so much for being with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Erica.
Thank you. Thank you to the New America Center. Thank you, Elliot, for putting out this piece, your provocative thoughts, just continuing the conversation in childcare and being a part of moving us forward to a better system for all families. So as Rebecca shared, I'm the Executive Director of the National Association for Family Childcare. It is the largest national organization focused on supporting high quality early care and education delivered in a home-based childcare setting. So more children spend time in home-based childcare than any other childcare setting. So I bring in the virtual room with me today, the tens of thousands of family childcare educators we partner with and empower to ensure that they get the respect and the resources they need to transform early experiences for children, to support families, and to uplift communities. So in preparation for today's webinar, I asked several of NAFCC's state representatives. They're all active providers with children every day. And I asked them for examples of employer-sponsored childcare that they've seen in home-based settings. And if this is something that they'd like to see more of, to see less of. And I didn't think that I would hear much of anything, but I was actually surprised that they had several examples, because you mostly hear about them on on-site centers or partnerships with large chains like Childcare that we talked about. They shared examples of partnerships with employers that benefited both the employee and the provider. These included tuition payments that came directly from hospitals and universities. Others had informal arrangements with small businesses. One provider had participated in a program for years to care for the children of Intel workers. They appreciated the employer-sponsored programs because they offered consistent payments that were often more than what parents could afford. But they did flag a few limitations, which many of them mirror to what Elliot shared in the report. So first, as Elliot shared, this fickleness, we need to term that, the fickleness to the corporate programs. Some lasted for a long time, some started and ended. They all eventually waned and ended. And that is, really difficult for a small program to sustain big changes like that. Second, they hoped that the employers would do more. It wasn't enough that they only paid for one slot for the times that one employee needed it. They needed more stability, and in dry times, that wasn't enough to keep a program going. And they also expressed the desire to have support with administrative tasks to support their continuing education and funds for renovating their spaces. And not surprisingly, that's not a role that we would expect to see from employers, but that is what's needed. And finally, they noted that most of the employer-sponsored childcare that they knew of or was starting now is not inclusive of home-based childcare. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But given that it's not good for the providers as well as for families. I did want to share that they pointed out one major employer who does many of the things that we're looking for, the military. It's the largest employer of a sponsored childcare program, but very few companies have the resources and the commitment to childcare that we've seen from the military. But I did want to share that example. So Elliot, in direct response to reading your report, we're aligned in many areas. We do need a robust publicly funded system. Employers can and should be a part of the solution, but they cannot be the primary avenue for our early care and education system like we see in health insurance. We do have a nuanced view because our members are also small business owners, but we feel strongly that childcare should not be limited or directly connected to your employment. And here's why. So first, it would be a missed opportunity if early education was only tied to the employment of the adults, caregivers, and their guardians. There's so many benefits of early care and education to young children, identifying developmental delays, providing opportunities to be with other children, continuity of care, and those goals are not necessarily aligned with employer-based care. Second, unfortunately, we have seen that employer-based systems will inevitably leave out home-based childcare programs, really small programs. Our ECE ecosystem, if you will, is very complicated. And most employers don't have the ability or the interest to navigate this. Many of the things that make family childcare amazing for families, the small size, the fact that they're working with multiple ages, they work non-traditional hours, they're really spread out location-wise, they speak different languages, also make it really difficult for them to partner directly with employers. We've seen family childcare programs come together to create co-ops or to contract with public and private entities. We're supporting things like that, but we know that most employer-based systems won't use those options. And losing a family childcare is more than just a childcare slot. And it's many of our current childcare programs are pillars in the community. And you hear about the role that they play, not only in caring for the child in that time, but also in showing up in the K through 12 schooling of that child, in connecting families to better educational or career opportunities. And so the role of home-based childcare goes beyond just keeping children safe and healthy for 9 to 5 or whenever the parents need to work. I know I'm getting close to the 5 minutes that we're allotted, but the only thing that I'll push back on is this opportunity cost and the both and argument. The problem with not taking a both and approach is that it isn't practical and it is very difficult for people who are living in our current paradigm. I know your feedback was aimed at advocates and not necessarily the families or the providers, but when I hear of providers who are doing Uber in the evening and then not sleeping at all or donating blood to make things work, you can't not seriously consider any options that could provide support. And I appreciate the call for us to be reflective. And, I think there is a lot of alignment between what we talked about. We wrote a piece with LIF in Semiconductor Digest about the CHIPS Act and really talking about how employers can be a part of that larger sort of future system and implementation of childcare services. So we agree they're part of a solution, but we do need a robust publicly funded early care system delivered across multiple settings, including home-based settings, that enable for life-sustaining wages for educators and early care and learning opportunities that are tailored for the needs of families.
Apologies. Nicole, thank you for that and for bringing up those points. And actually, the CHIPS Act has come up in some of our questions that have come from the audience, so I'm sure we'll be discussing this in more detail. I want to turn over to Nicole Reel from Executives Partnering to Invest in Children.
Well, hi, everyone, and thank you again for having me on today. Appreciate my co-panelists and everyone inviting me here. So I'm Nicole Reel. I serve as President and CEO at Executives Partnering to Invest in Children. We are based in beautiful Colorado, which is the Colorado sunrise behind me in my background. And we work with over 70 business executives and business leaders to advocate for early childhood investments, policies, and workforce solutions. I appreciate, Elliot, you including EPIC as a bright spot in your report in our work for young children and families. And of course, we work hard to make sure that we are engaging the business community in really all aspects of supporting early care and education, which does include helping employers address this for their own workforce. And I am of the mindset that we really can have both happening at once, and that it really comes down to how do we help employers understand the nuances of addressing these needs for their workforce. I think we all agree on the fact that employers being engaged in this discussion is a good thing, and it's critically important to our early care and education sector, to our economy, our national security, and of course, the strength of our American families and the development of children themselves. The reality is that our employers recognize that their communities have an issue today and right now. We have employers operating in small towns where 80 babies are born each year, and there's only 8 licensed childcare slots for infants, very limited informal care, and it's too expensive from a real estate perspective, oftentimes, to operate a family childcare home in some of these communities. So they know that an employee is likely submitting their notice tomorrow because they're giving birth to a new baby and they have no options for childcare. And of course, most often these are women leaving the workforce as well. So they really oftentimes need and want to find these solutions, not just for the benefit of their own employees, but for the benefit of their larger communities. These employers care about their communities greatly. They want to be good community partners. They want to keep our national economy strong, and families need to put food on the table. So it's not a feasible solution for employers to sit around and wait for, an ideal solution to come around and additional funding systems to be put into place. EPIC has engaged in projects that are debunking many of the considerations that Elliot talked about earlier, where our employer-based childcare design lab, for example, that now we've launched our 3rd lab, has worked primarily with small and mid-sized companies in rural and frontier areas of Colorado to implement childcare solutions that address the needs of their employees and their communities in an equitable way. We've really specialized in helping employers understand not only the needs of their employees and their communities, but then also what are the potential solutions and plans they can look to implement and think about in terms of how do they meet those needs of their workforce and communities in an equitable and a sustainable way. Oftentimes, this is about understanding what this business model really looks like, what that commitment to childcare is, and how that feeds into their role as an employer and as an organization in the community, and their strategic rationale and their own business planning. And we help them implement those and find the right partners to work with. In nearly all of these cases, these solutions incorporate systemic investments, workforce investments that employers are making locally, thinking about how they build the childcare system, including family childcare and informal care systems locally, and they can be folded into a more public support model should that come to fruition. I will also note that these solutions are incorporated very quickly, and employers are very effective at getting other local leaders involved in these projects. And they leverage relationships and bring a tremendous amount of funding and public support and will to this process. In the employer-based childcare grant program, for example, that we have in Colorado, we see employers typically bringing a 5 or 4-to-1 match from a financial contribution perspective to many of these projects when they're implementing projects. They're very good at, again, getting those local leaders involved in these things and moving very, very quickly, much faster than we know these systems could ever happen or move if we had a governmental system that was being implemented. So again, these are solutions that employers are taking action today to support these families. And in the meantime, these solutions are serving families, including many employees who have lower household incomes or have great challenges accessing these opportunities. And I don't think any of them today would say that they would support putting a halt to the existing employer benefits and or efforts that are happening in the hopes that a larger solution or funding model emerges. On the flip side of this, and Elliot, you alluded to this earlier, these employer efforts are also making for better policy and advocacy efforts. Employers implementing these solutions and becoming more familiar with the business model of childcare and the financial challenges that exist in that space, are also becoming greater advocates. And they love to lean in on not only supporting policies, but supporting policy design to make sure that we are designing the solutions that are going to be efficient, effective, and really make the change that we're seeking. You know, the rubber hits the road with good design for public investments. And, you know, I think it's about not just telling business leaders, hey, get in line and support a publicly funded system, but let's have those tough conversations. Let's let business leaders and employers lean in on these design conversations and talk about how we can do better. How do we design a system that's built for the users, the families, the providers, and how do we address pain points in the childcare business model to help it be more sustainable and support it in a variety of ways? From our perspective, there really isn't a world, and certainly we've witnessed a lot of great progress here in Colorado, where we don't end up with the best possible outcome through public-private partnership. With the help of business leaders and employers in Colorado, we've made a huge amount of progress on increasing the early childhood educator workforce through increased investments, tax credits, hopefully better compensation through some of the strategies I talked about. We've passed universal preschool in Colorado, and business leaders got behind that investment and certainly saw the benefit for that as well. So again, appreciate the comments and the thoughts today. We're really excited about the work that we do with business leaders to help them be informed advocates and partners in this effort, and certainly see an important and key role for them moving forward.
Thank you. And I really appreciate your personal example of working on the ground and what that brings to the conversation. So thank you, Nicole. Next up is Carmi Mehta, founder and CEO of Onsite Kids.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm very grateful to be a part of this conversation. So Onsite Kids is a new company that develops and operates on-site childcare centers for the frontline workforce. And I really want to do what Elliot did and start with where we agree, and really address that we totally believe that an inclusive, fair, high-quality, publicly funded system is the ideal to strive for. But we also agree that we're very far from that ideal, and rather that this is very much an all-hands-on-deck situation, and that employers do have a critical role to play in building this system. And I actually want to zoom in even further and say that we agree that what we're looking for from employers is meaningful investment and energy. So I don't think that superficial stipends or hoarding community center spots does anything to support the system, and is neutral at best, is negative at worst. And we certainly don't want employers to feel off the hook and, when they check the box and move on. But in my experience in building on-site kids, I'm really hopeful because I see a growing number of employers who are raising their hands and wanting to take meaningful action and get involved. So it feels like this is our moment to waste in bringing them to the table. And I want to highlight three things that I think they do really well when they do get involved and sit down at the table, and three opportunities we have. So the first is around teacher quality and quantity, because I think that employer-sponsored programs, thanks to the funding, have an opportunity to provide stable, well-funded positions for early childhood educators. And being fully aware of the risk of poaching teachers from community centers, I still want to stay very focused on the root cause, which is that we need to make childcare a rewarding, sustainable career path. And so with employer sponsorship, when we can create these jobs and provide these jobs, and in the case of on-site kids, even provide employee ownership opportunities for teachers or center staff, we're really making sure that this pipeline stays open, stays alive, and really try to bring back respect and livable wages and all of that to this profession. Number two, I think the capacity building. Like we are missing millions and millions of slots, and employers do some things very, very well. One of those things is that they can bring quick funding, as Nicole mentioned. They can bring experts to building facilities in these childcare deserts, and they can create spots, they can create buildings. And when they do that, not only do they help their employees, but they do free up spots in the community centers, in these childcare deserts that other families can then access. So I do think that they do actually add to the system capacity. And then lastly, I think this employer education piece, this on-ramp to advocacy is very real. It takes an entire village to educate these employers. And I think when we're bringing these benefits to these companies, we're not going at it alone. It's in partnership with the CCR&Rs and the Chamber and the Economic Development Corporation, et cetera. And we are teaching employers how to care for their employees, how to engage with their communities where they've planted their sites. And I think, in the last year, we've met with over 100 companies, and for all but a handful, it's the first childcare conversation they've ever taken seriously or had. So I don't think that their advocacy happens out of thin air. So I believe that, it is not perfect. It is not comprehensive. This is not the only path by any means, but I want to put all the energy into celebrating the employers who are raising their hands to get involved, celebrate the entrepreneurs who are trying to find sustainable models. And the funding, I hope, will start to shift and become more publicly funded than privately funded. But we need to have a variety of models ready to go to honor parent preferences. So I would say I hope government does more, but I certainly don't hope that employers do less. And that's kind of my take on this.
Thank you so much, Carmi. We're going to go to Miriam. Before we do, I know we're running against time, so if our panelists can stay a few more minutes, we'll try and answer a few of the questions because we've been really pleased with the audience asking these very targeted questions about this very important topic. So Miriam, on to you. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Rebecca. I'll try to talk really fast. Again, I really extend my thanks to Elliot and Bridget for your work. I was really excited to read the paper and really appreciate all the comments so far from my fellow panelists. So I think the first point I found myself reflecting on was like how this issue, and I think you get the paper gets at this in numerous ways, is really issue of sort of employer-sponsored childcare is like, again, reminding me of the divide in our field between education and care, and how this is still such a not settled matter in policy, and like this is just squarely in that for me. And to my point about it not being a settled matter in policy, I think a recent example is the Build Back Better Act. And, we had two separate titles there related in that bill related to early care and education. One, when it was called Childcare, had parent copays. It had, a work requirement, less defined standards around, ECE, educator pay, qualifications, quality requirements, juxtaposed to a title that was called Universal Preschool, that was free for families, more rigorous requirements around educator compensation, qualifications, and quality services, and no work requirement, right? So I think that, we're still at the heart of this, really trying to decide, like, which is it? Is it one or the other? Is it both? Again, the paper talks about this. I mean, I'm reminded of, I was at the start of the pandemic running the early learning agency in Oregon. And when we closed schools and we opened up emergency childcare only, I had a conversation with the governor at the time about how the K-12 system was the state's largest childcare provider, essentially. But it isn't looked at, I think, as, Elliot and Bridget talk about in the paper, solely that. We started getting in those very early days, weeks of the pandemic after the K-12 school closure, calls from employers of all sizes, not just large employers, asking what they needed to do to open up on-site childcare, emergency on-site childcare. And it was interesting because prior to that, we were seeing a decline in employer-sponsored on-site childcare. I think for the reasons we know, it's hard work. It's hard, hard to run these businesses. And I really think that, really in those early weeks, childcare was open, not as much, but it was getting up and going. A lot of the providers were transitioning to emergency childcare, to just operating under different regulations. I think a big part of it was the closure of K-12, to my point about it being the largest, childcare provider in the state. So I think that from my perspective, why I really went there and really wanted to bring this up is, I think we have to really, it's a both and, in my opinion. And I think we have to think about, what then that means for what we set up as expectations, right? For what the role of employers are, what role they're going to play in this, and not reinforce narratives around this being, solely a work support, like in this policy area. And that goes to my second point I want to make really quickly, which is related to accountability and evidence, is the other thing I found myself thinking about, right? Like, so as we've moved into this area, what are our expectations around children's development and learning in this policy space when we set policies around employer-sponsored childcare? What are policies are we putting in place and safeguards around the fairness issues that have been lifted up in the paper? And, what are we learning kind of from these areas? We have a lot of evidence, for example, universal preschool in DC increased mothers' labor force participation and increased, has benefits to kindergarten readiness. As we know, high quality preschool programs can benefit children, high quality childcare. So how are we thinking about that in this? And I'll, in the interest of time, I have a lot more to say there, but I think we have a lot of examples, including in the CHIPS Act, where we could be very intentional, right, about really trying to think about how are we building the evidence base around these policies. And so the last point I'll make is really about what meets the moment in terms of their role, because I agree with everything that's been said in the paper and the panelists. Like, this is it's not like they don't have a role. They have a really important role and they clearly benefit. So I thought about some things like childcare is still very difficult to find and locate for families and communities who really haven't built those systems. So some things that they can do there, planning. We had some examples in Oregon where businesses were really key in helping us know where to build supply, right? Where were the real pain points currently in communities? We know we don't have enough in general, but where are they building new plants or new, large employers? Or where are they hearing from employees? And that's, again, another critical data point, and great examples of where businesses are really helpful in highlighting those like priorities within priority communities and helping bring partners to the table. I mentioned that, I think, building the evidence base with the equity lens. And then I think really around some of the advocacy issues. I think in particular, it's a dynamic time in terms of policy development. I think we're like 50 years at least behind in building the system that we need. And if I think we don't, we have examples of business leaders, like ones that we've talked about here, both of, you, Nicole, Carmi, others, Ready Nation, but also in K-12, where business leaders stand up and say, we're invested in education because of the future workforce, and that's in our bottom line too. I think, again, the same thing, given my point about the education versus care divide, can be aligned here. So how are they helping us identify those palatable financing strategies that are going to work in states and at the federal level to get this public system funding, and helping us design the policies, right? Building on where we are right now that will help make a public system really work for employers as well, because they're important stakeholders. So thanks, Elliot.
Thank you so much for that, Miriam. We're going to take a few questions that people can stay a little bit past to about 3:15 if people have time. And I wanted to start with the one on the CHIPS Act, which is what many of our panelists have already mentioned, which is the CHIPS and Science Act. And the question is, and I'll turn it to Elliot first, what are the risks and opportunities posed by the CHIPS Act childcare requirement, and how do we address those?
Yeah, thank you. And again, I want to thank the panelists. This is such a good example of, I think, why this is such an important conversation. And there's no one right answer. And if one thing comes out of this report is that we have more of these conversations nationally and states and local communities, then like that will, to me, have been a big success. So I think CHIPS Act is an interesting example of where, again, applaud the intention. I think is a great sort of thought behind it of how particularly with a relatively gridlocked Congress, like what's something that the federal government can do to try to get more attention and more childcare going. I'm gonna punt a little bit of the opportunities over to Erica, because I know that she's done some writing on this. But I think one of the risks, and I keep sort of coming back to this philosophical question, because I think the question isn't so much, should things like on-site childcare again exist? I actually agree with Nicole. If tomorrow all the on-site childcare programs in the country, like the employers said, like we're out, like that would be bad. I don't want that to happen. And there's a question of, should government be incentivizing, or in this case, requiring it. And an interesting that happened after the CHIPS Act was released, it started sort of a series of thought pieces, op-eds, and various other sort of conversations about like some people are like, oh, this is overreach, like we're getting into things that have nothing to do with semiconductor manufacturing. And there were folks like the New York Times editorial board member who wrote, this is great, and this should be extended to every recipient of government funding, and really this should be extended to every employer and employee in the country. And that's where I'm like, this is actually opening potentially the floodgates, because the more that we have, I mean, a Democratic administration saying like, actually, we're gonna put again employers at the front of the childcare solution. It takes us, in my mind, again, a kind of a further away from the conversation about the broader positioning of childcare in society and the broader fight for the public system. So to me, it's that's more of the risk that's inherent in that. But yeah, Erica, if I can just give it over to you, I thought that, I know you did some thinking about what opportunities exist within that.
We have done thinking, but I don't think it's because we're excited and saying, oh my gosh, semiconductor plants have to have childcare. It is a realization that if we're not informing employers about the childcare landscape, the result of things like this could actually be more damaging to our workforce and therefore care that other families rely on. So I think it's more of a willingness to partner and to raise education levels and awareness around what we're seeing, and yes, there are, I mean, potential opportunities, but others could probably speak to like more near-term ones. I do just want to go to this thought around the need to supply build. And yes, we know the stat that a half of Americans, families live in childcare deserts officially. But that's feels like a paradox when we also know so many childcare programs are closing. And it's not that we don't have people who want to run childcare programs. It's that it's a leaky bucket. And when we put out more programs, if fundamentally the environment, the policies, the funding hasn't changed, then we're going to end up with the same thing. And I think part of that might be what's happening with some of the on-site childcare programs, where it is just incredibly difficult to run childcare on our current system, even for companies. And so I think the opportunity could be that we're bringing more partners along, more corporate partners along, like Nicole was saying, and they then become stronger advocates for a system, a robust foundation of a system where employers can build on and tailor things to their specific communities. But mostly, just a real awareness that we have to raise some of these concerns and some of the facts of the childcare ecosystem. So
Thank you for that. We also, part of the things we do at Better Life Lab is we really highlight a lot of bright spots and sort of use the solutions journalism framework to raise the narrative. So we had a question I wanted to address to Nicole to see if she had any examples of employers you've worked with who have, and you can just give, you don't have to be as specific as you want or not, who support care for families in the community who are not employees.
Yeah, so I'll say most of the employers we've worked with who have decided to build facilities have constructed facilities that not only serve their employees, but also serve the larger community. So an example of that would be in a rural area of Colorado. We worked with a hospital to construct a childcare facility where childcare was desperately needed. They had the land, they raised $5 million to construct a new facility, and then they worked with a local childcare operator who had been wanting to expand her business for a very long time. But really could never have access to the capital and the resources to do that. And then contracted with her to operate the childcare facility on their campus, but it's also open to the community as well. I would say we've also seen employers invest in, larger scale workforce development programs and also more systemic solutions locally in partnership with local resource and referral agencies or early childhood councils that we have here in Colorado. So we've definitely seen employers tackle this from multiple approaches and try to make sure that they're also doing this again from a very community informed perspective. I think with even the CHIPS solutions, right? We have tens of thousands of people in Colorado alone sitting out of our workforce who are skilled and want to be in jobs and in the workforce. And so if we can help them address that problem through childcare solutions, it really, again, comes down to understanding those needs of families and preferences of families and the needs in the community and implementing more nuanced solutions where employers are really fully apprised and walking into that eyes wide open, understanding what those short-term and long-term investments and implementations look like for them and how they can support that community and be a good partner.
Wow, great. Next question I also had is for either Carmi or Miriam, if you guys, either one wants to weigh in, about how realistic do you anticipate it being that businesses would advocate for a public system?
My two cents is I catch companies very early in their education journey. So I don't see them ready for that. I'm very hopeful that they'll get there, as evidenced by the example in Vermont and what Nicole is educating businesses on in Colorado. The companies that I generally spend time with don't have the hand-holding in place to get there. So I want to be a part of that, but I don't feel like I have a roster of companies ready to go on the public advocacy front.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just underscore Carmi's point. I think that the work of organizations like Nicole and others that do the education and businesses talking with other businesses or intermediaries is just critical. Like in Oregon, for example, in 2019, we passed a new, corporate activities tax in the state that raised money for public education, $1 billion annually. 200 million went to early childhood, and that was something that took decades and largely was opposition from the business community session after session, until finally it was working with a subset of business leaders and to be able to get it over the line and some other political shifts in terms of the composition of the legislature, but still really needed that support from business communities. And so the business community and a subset of it. I think it was difficult, but I think that's, to my point, finding them at the table, finding those palatable solutions, both on like what are the funding options and sources of revenue, but also ways in which they help inform, right? What are the policies? How is this public system going to benefit them in the long run as well is important. And I would say it's childcare is a piece of it. Other policies like paid and sick leave, I think would be remiss in saying is not a really, really important part of this equation too.
That is a perfect segue to the final question. Even though this is the last question, this is by no means the end of this conversation, and we hope everybody will have a chance to read Elliot's report and continue this conversation as we talk about childcare advocacy. But one of the questions that came up and Elliot has addressed in detail in his report is, what can we learn from employer subsidization of healthcare? Healthcare is a public good, but in our country it does fall to employers. So Elliot.
Yeah, let's call healthcare kind of a cautionary tale. So very briefly, during World War II, employer-sponsored healthcare started to show up as a perk because there were national wage limits. Basically, huge labor force goes haywire because everyone's off at war, and they needed to make sure that there were enough workers in enough industries, and so they imposed some pretty strong restrictions on what employers could do, so they couldn't just outcompete each other. Some employers started offering health insurance as a perk to incentive to get employees. Coming out of the war, President Truman proposes a national health plan, which is pretty close to what the UK ended up becoming their national health service. But what was interesting was that opposition was not just from the business community around that. Opposition was also from some of the labor unions, because they had started to really like their health insurance benefits that they they were getting. And they thought that was an easier road to hew, was just to keep getting those benefits to the employers. And so they helped defeat that law. We have not come close to the equivalent moment of getting any kind of national healthcare system in place. And, I think it's probably fair to say most people would agree the US health insurance system is not fantastic. And running, employer through your employer is not ideal. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot we can learn. We say actually like, so this idea that today's sort of stopgap measure can become tomorrow's status quo. I guess that is my ultimate fear. It becomes the more that we put, again, public money behind this and say we're not spending it on a public system, we're not spending it on subsidizing care, for family child care and for FFNs, we're not spending it for targeting lower income family. We're spending it to incentivize employers. Instead, like that does political science tells us that starts to shift sort of like what the solution set is, and it makes it easier. I mean, so yes, I think health insurance is a cautionary tale. I don't think that again, like I think the thoughts and the intentions here are all incredibly good. And we've heard, right, examples from panelists of some employers doing some amazing things. I think some of them, many of them should be applauded for that. But there is a question. We should cast our minds forward. I'm going to come back to that kind of as a closing thought. We think about how we're allocating our financial resources, our advocacy resources, our political resources, and we think about, 10 years down the road, the childcare system we want to have. Like, I would challenge us to think about what it means to have so much government attention. And this is happening. I mean, there are legislative sessions around the country, and where right now, like today, conversation and bills are moving. So this is a live, active conversation. I think we need to think about what path we're setting ourselves on, and are we going to look back at this moment in 10, 20, 50 years and say, we kind of wish we had made some different decisions.
Well, that is an excellent note to end on, that today's stopgap measure can become tomorrow's status quo. I think that is very powerful indeed. And I want to thank our panelists, Miriam, Erica, Nicole, Carmi, for joining us. I want to thank Elliot for partnering with the Better Life Lab to put your report out. And I encourage everyone to follow what the Better Life Lab is doing. Narrative change is part of our mission. So we hope to have more of these conversations, both in these formats as well as in print and in journalism, and so we can see what care looks like for our country and create a better, more equitable future together. Again, thank you for those of you who stayed for running over. Thank you to the New America events team, and thank you to everyone who cares and for showing up for this issue.